Some stories do not begin with a shock. There is no screaming, no doors slammed shut. They begin with silence. A silence that lasts so long, people forget it exists. The silence of those who are looked straight through, as if they were merely part of the wall, the floor, the space itself, rather than a human being with thoughts, a past, and dreams. For 7 years, she had walked these hallways every night, pushing a squeaking cleaning cart, wiping down glass tables where others signed contracts worth millions of dollars. And not a single one of them had ever asked her a straightforward question. "What's your name?" They only called her the janitor. That building stood in the heart of New York, the city of ambition, power, and expensive suits. A place where people believe that if you are not sitting in the boardroom, you have no voice. If you are not wearing a suit, you have no value. And if you are pushing a cleaning cart, you do not need to be heard. Her name is Emily Carter, 27 years old. She works the night shift at a high-end fashion and retail conglomerate called Weston and Cole Group. By day, she takes care of her mother, who suffered a stroke and lies motionless in a cramped apartment in Queens. By night, she cleans the offices of people who have never once looked her in the eye. And then, on a morning that seemed perfectly ordinary, everything began to change. In the conference room on the top floor, the CEO's voice rang out, urgent and tense. A merger contract from a French partner had just arrived. 30 pages. Complex legal language. Deadline? 48 hours. He said a single sentence that made the entire room fall silent. "I'll pay $30,000 to anyone who can accurately translate this document." $30,000. A number far too small for the people sitting around that table. But to Emily, it was the amount that could keep the locks off her apartment door. The money could keep her mother in the hospital for a few more days. A breath of air she had not had in years. The silence lingered. Then a laugh broke out. "Why don't we ask the janitor?" The entire room laughed along, not out of cruelty, just habit. The kind of laughter born from absolute certainty that those outside the boardroom do not belong in the conversation. Emily stood in the hallway, a cleaning cloth still in her hand. She lowered her head, as she always did. No one noticed that her hand was trembling slightly, because no one in that room knew that Emily could read and understand every single line of that contract. No one knew she spoke fluent French, Arabic, and English, and had a deep understanding of the language of business, law, and negotiation culture. No one knew that the terminology confusing them had once been dinner table conversation in her family. They didn't know, because they had never asked. And perhaps they had never imagined that the person who would decide the fate of the entire company was standing just one glass wall away, in a simple gray uniform with a cleaning cart by her side. This story is not about a miracle. It is a story about people who are treated as if they are invisible, about talent that goes unnoticed, and about the moment when someone is forced to choose, to remain silent to survive, or to step forward and change everything. And that, it's only the beginning. If you want to understand a person, don't look at the moment they stand under the spotlight. Look at the hours no one ever sees. For Emily Carter, those hours begin when the city sinks into darkness. Every evening, precisely at 6 p.m., she enters the Weston and Cole building through the back door, the entrance reserved for janitorial staff, security, and those whose schedules never appear in internal emails. The security guard nods at her. They don't say much. People who work the night shift don't need explanations. They understand each other through tired eyes. Emily pushes her cleaning cart up to the top floor. There, the offices are brightly lit, yet cold, preserved as if their owners might return at any moment. Expensive leather chairs, abstract paintings on the walls, glass boards crowded with growth strategies, profit targets, and restructuring plans. Emily cleans everything, gently, carefully, leaving no trace that she was ever there. She is used to being unnoticed. But what makes Emily different from the others is that she listens. Throughout 7 years of working here, she has heard everything. Rushed phone calls in French. Conversations in Arabic are spoken when they believe no one understands. Jokes, secrets, and deals are whispered the moment the conference room doors close. And she understands it all. Emily knows that this corporation once cut employee pension funds to purchase a vacation property in the Hamptons. She knows an award-winning marketing campaign was taken from a young intern without credit. She knows the speeches about diversity and inclusion exist only on the website, while the leadership floor rarely changes its faces. But Emily has never spoken up. Not because she lacks thoughts, but because speaking up comes at a price that is too high. After each shift, she leaves the building close to midnight. She catches the last subway train back to Queens. In her backpack are unpaid bills and a box of her mother's medication. Their apartment is so small that the living room also serves as the bedroom. The hospital bed is pushed up against the window. The steady sound of the breathing machine fills the night, reminding Emily that every decision she makes has a direct impact on another life. Her mother was once a skilled accountant, a woman who always told Emily, "You have to study, you have to go farther than I ever did." But life never asks for permission. A stroke, a cold insurance system, and a 21-year-old daughter forced to learn how to grow up in just a few months. Emily works 3 jobs. At night, she is a janitor. By day, she translates documents online under a pseudonym. The rest of her time belongs to her mother, to medication, follow-up appointments, and the constant fear that tomorrow might be worse than today. She sleeps an average of 3 hours a day, not because she is used to being sleep-deprived, but because she has no choice. Every month, the numbers repeat with ruthless precision. Rent, medical bills, utilities, food. There is no room for mistakes, no safety net. And throughout all that, inside that glass building, Emily is still the janitor. They don't know that when they say, "No one in this building is good enough," the one who is good enough is standing right behind them, wiping clean the table where they just set down their coffee cup. Emily understands one thing clearly. Intelligence does not protect anyone without power. But precisely because of that, when opportunity appears, it is not just about money. It is the biggest question Emily has ever had to face. Is it time for the invisible person to step out of the shadows? And the answer: it will not be easy. Some people are only truly mentioned after they are no longer there. For Emily Carter, her father, Michael Carter, was one such name. No longer appearing in internal emails, no longer on the employee roster, no longer part of the stories that the company tells about itself. But to Emily, he never disappeared. Before becoming someone who was laid off, Michael Carter had been an indispensable part of Weston and Cole Group. 18 years, nearly 2 decades behind the international deals the company was always proud of. He was not the man on stage, not the one signing his name on the final line. He was the one who laid the groundwork, the one who read every sentence, understood every cultural nuance, and told leadership what they needed to hear, even when they didn't want to hear it. Michael spoke French like a native. He spoke Arabic with the refinement of a scholar. and he spoke English with the caution of someone who understood that, in business, one wrong word could cost hundreds of people their livelihoods. To him, language was not just a tool, it was a responsibility. Emily grew up surrounded by those conversations. In their small kitchen, while her mother cooked dinner, Michael would sit across from Emily, explaining why a word in a contract should never be translated literally, why the French valued tradition over short-term profit, why, before negotiating, must one understand the person on the other side of the table, rather than just the numbers. Language is how you enter someone else's world, he often said. If you use it carelessly, you will hurt them. But the world was not kind to people like Michael Carter. One morning he was called into a conference room. No lengthy explanation, no chance to argue. 2 short words. Restructuring. 18 years of experience were folded into a thin envelope. No severance, no letter of recommendation, no thank you. Worse still was what came after. Michael sent out his resume everywhere. No responses, no calls, no formal rejections, only a silence that stretched into something frightening. Emily slowly understood. No one said it outright, but her father's name was being whispered through professional corridors, labeled as no longer suitable, marked as a risk. That silence wore him down day by day. Financial pressure, mounting bills, the feeling of betrayal by the very place to which he had given his youth. Then one night, Michael collapsed in the living room. The stroke came faster than any apology ever could. Emily was only 21 years old, too young to fully understand loss, too young to carry an entire family on her shoulders. Her father died, leaving behind medical debt, a shattered wife, and a daughter forced to grow up after a single phone call from the hospital. The only thing Emily managed to keep, it was her father's fountain pen. Not an expensive object, but the one thing he held every time he worked, every time he signed a draft, every time he scribbled notes in the margins of a contract. Others never bothered to read closely. Emily kept that pen as a reminder that her father had existed, that he was not the failure the company tried to erase. And above all, it was a reminder that what her father left behind was not a job. It was knowledge, principle, and the belief that if someone was willing to read carefully, listen closely, and understand deeply, they could prevent many terrible things from happening. Emily understood that the contract lying on that conference table was not just an opportunity. It was a legacy. And for the first time in many years, she felt her father standing very close, as if he were waiting to see whether she had the courage to do what he had done his entire life. Some opportunities do not arrive with light. They arrive with trembling. For Emily Carter, that opportunity did not look like luck. It took the form of a contract, thick, cold, and silent. 30 pages of paper that could decide the fate of hundreds of people. And her own. That morning, the conference room on the top floor was packed, perfectly tailored suits. Laptops are already open. Cups of black coffee are not yet cooled. Emily stood in the hallway, wiping the glass wall, listening to every word slipping through the narrow gap in the door. The CEO repeated the offer, this time more slowly, more clearly, as if he wanted everyone to understand he was not joking. $30,000. Anyone who can accurately translate this contract within 48 hours, the money is theirs. No one answered. Glances were exchanged, subtle shakes of the head. A few people looked down at their screens, pretending to be busy, not because they weren't intelligent, but because they were afraid of being wrong. They knew that in their world, a mistranslated clause was not just a language mistake. It meant lawsuits, job losses, being pushed out of a chair they had spent their entire lives climbing toward. And then, As a familiar reflex, the tension was released with a burst of laughter. "Maybe we should ask the janitor," a voice said, half joking, half serious. "Who knows? Maybe she's better at French than everyone in this room." Laughter broke out. Not cruel, not loud, just enough to close the door on every other possibility. Emily lowered her head. She was used to that kind of laughter. It wasn't aimed at her. It erased her from the conversation. But this time, the feeling inside her was different. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a short message, cold, emotionless. "Final notice. Rent overdue. Eviction proceedings will begin within 72 hours. Emily stood still for a long time. $30,000. A number they treated as a temporary bonus. For her, it was her mother's medication, extra days in the hospital, a home whose locks would not be changed. But at the same time, another fear rose inside her. If she stepped forward, how would they look at her? With surprise? Suspicion? Or irritation that someone out of place had disrupted the familiar order? Emily was familiar with the rules of this place. She had seen talented people pushed aside for speaking at the wrong moment. Those who stayed silent survived. Those who spoke up disappeared. And she still had her mother. A fragile insurance system, a job, humble, degrading, that kept life going. That opportunity, therefore, was not an open door. It was a double-edged blade. If she stepped forward, she might save her family. But she could also lose everything in a single day. If she remained silent, she would continue to survive. But she would have to accept that the contract would be translated by people who did not fully understand it. Accept that the lessons her father once taught would be distorted. And perhaps accept that the consequences of that silence would fall on people who had no voice at all. Emily clenched her father's pen inside her pocket. She suddenly realized something terrifying. No choice was safe. There are moments in life when you are not standing between right and wrong. You are standing between survival and becoming someone you can respect. Emily took a deep breath. Inside the conference room, the laughter had faded. The contract still lay on the table, waiting for someone brave enough to read it for what it truly was. And for the first time in many years, Emily understood this. This opportunity was not asking whether she was ready. It was asking only one question. Would she remain invisible or step forward and accept the price of the truth? There is a truth few people ever say out loud. Not everyone who is capable is allowed to show it. For Emily Carter, talent was not a ticket that could move her forward. It was something she had to keep hidden, like a secret that could cause everything to collapse if discovered. After that morning, Emily no longer looked at the contract as a lifeless stack of paper. She saw in it the lines her father had taught her to treat with care. Clauses written in language that appeared polite, yet sharp enough to cut into the fate of hundreds of people. And she knew that if the people in that conference room translated it the way they were doing now, many things would be misunderstood, or worse, deliberately misrepresented. But Emily also knew her place. She was the one who cleaned the floors, not the one invited to speak, not the one allowed to be wrong. This world allowed her to exist, as long as she didn't make it uncomfortable. So Emily chose the only path left, to remain in the shadows. By day, when her mother drifted off to sleep from the medication, Emily opened her old laptop. She logged into an account that did not carry her name. Online, she was not a janitor. She was Bridge Lex, a name without a face, without an address. Only rows of 5-star reviews and messages of gratitude from around the world. More than 500 translations, legal contracts, business documents, languages that people believed only properly certified experts could handle. Emily did all of it in silence. She never bragged, never updated a personal profile, never told anyone she was good. Because in the real world, her talent was not protected. The cleaning job gave her health insurance, and that insurance kept her mother alive. All it would take was a suspicion, a whisper, a misdirected email, and everything could disappear. Emily understood precisely what the price of stepping into the light was, but the contract would not leave her alone. On Saturday night, when the entire building sank into silence, Emily returned for an extra shift. Gray uniform, cleaning cart. No one suspected a thing. The security guard nodded at her, as always. He didn't know that in the small pouch at the side of her cart, Emily carried more than cleaning rags. She stopped in front of the conference room. The whiteboard was still there. Incomplete translations, terms misunderstood so badly that they made her frown. Emily stood there for a long time. Then she took out her father's pen, not to rewrite everything. She was smart enough to know that would be too dangerous. She corrected only a few points, the ones that only someone who truly understood would notice, the ones just enough to say, "Someone here knows what they're doing." She wrote carefully, not hurried, not showy. In the end, she signed her name, not her real one. Midnight Bridge. A small bridge, built in the middle of the night. No one knows who built it. Emily left the conference room as if she had never entered, wiped the table again, pushed the cart forward. But her heart was racing, because for the first time in many years, she had left a trace. Not to be seen, but to test whether this world could recognize value when it was not attached to a title or an expensive suit. Emily didn't know what would happen the next morning. She didn't know whether that mark of ink would be erased, stolen, or dismissed as a joke. She knew only one thing. Once intelligence has touched the truth, it can never return to being invisible as it was before. And in that darkness, a larger story had begun to shift. There is a kind of hurt that makes no sound. It doesn't knock you down immediately. It only leaves your heart hollow for a very brief breath, but long enough for you to know that something has just been taken from you. The next morning, Emily arrived earlier than usual. She pushed her cleaning cart toward the conference room, following a habit that had been ingrained over the course of 7 years. The transparent glass door allowed her to see clearly inside. The familiar suits, the faces focused on the whiteboard. And then she saw it. The lines of text, the revisions. The terms were corrected precisely. It was her handwriting, unmistakable. Emily's heart pounded. Part of her felt relief, at least they had seen the value of those corrections. But that feeling lasted exactly 1 second, because at that moment, Richard Ross stood up, Vice President of Strategy, Ivy League graduate, the man who always spoke about personal effort and leadership spirit. He picked up the marker, pointed at the board, and said in a calm voice, "I reviewed this section last night. I studied French privately for a while. I didn't want to draw attention, but in an urgent situation I felt I should step in." No one objected. No one asked another question. The CEO smiled with satisfaction, a pat on the shoulder, a word of praise. Emily stood outside, her hand gripping the handle of the cart tightly. The name Midnight Bridge was gone, completely erased, as if it had never existed. Just like her father years ago. No one in that room knew they were praising a man who had stolen someone else's work. And no one realized that the person whose work had been stolen was standing only a few steps away, in a gray uniform, eyes lowered. The feeling was not unfamiliar to Emily. She had seen it repeated many times throughout her years working here. Ideas taken, credit assigned to another name. Those with power moved forward. Those who stayed silent disappeared. But this time, it was different. Because it was not just her work, it was her father's legacy, what he had taught, protected, and believed in. Emily wanted to scream, to say it was her, to say he was lying. But she couldn't. Not because she was weak, but because she understood the consequences all too well. One sentence spoken at the wrong time, one look held for too long, and she would lose her job, lose her insurance, lose any way to keep her mother in the hospital. So Emily did what she had done for many years. She stayed silent. She pushed the cart onward, wiped the tables that had just witnessed injustice, picked up scraps of paper beneath the feet of those who had just been praised. But something had changed. Before, Emily's silence was a way to survive. Now, that silence was being exploited. That night, back in the small apartment, Emily could not sleep. She spread out the photographed pages of the contract on the table, reread each clause. Each line seemed to ask her an uncomfortable question. If you stay silent, who will bear the consequences? And then she saw it. A clause, cleverly concealed, a phrase that sounded harmless, but when understood correctly, it meant laying off hundreds of workers within a 2-month period. Emily sat frozen. Those people were unaware of this contract. They would have no choice, no time to prepare, just like her father, years ago. Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Her father's pen lay in her hand, heavier than it had ever been. For the first time, she understood this clearly. Her silence was no longer harmless, and if she continued to let others speak in place of the truth, then she was also helping to distort it. Somewhere deep inside, a slow determination began to form. She might not be ready to step into the light yet, but she could no longer allow the darkness to be used by others. The game had changed, and Emily knew her silence was about to stop being the safe choice. There are moments when you are no longer choosing between right and wrong. You are forced to choose between silence and being eliminated. After that morning's meeting, the atmosphere inside the Weston and Cole building shifted in an unsettling way. No one said it out loud, but everything became tighter. Doors were locked earlier. Additional security cameras appeared along the executive hallways. New policies were circulated, brief, cold, and not explained. Emily felt it immediately during her first shift. Eyes lingered longer as she passed by, not with curiosity, but with evaluation. They were looking for someone, and Emily knew that person might very well be her. That afternoon, her direct supervisor called Emily into the break room. His voice was polite, but his eyes were not. Security needs to ask you a few questions, just a formality. Emily nodded. She was accustomed to being summoned for things that had nothing to do with her promotion. The security room was flooded with white light. 2 men sat across from her. A thin file lay on the table between them. They asked simple questions: name, work hours, assigned areas. Emily answered in an even tone, deliberately slowing herself down, as if English were not a language she used every day. I just clean. I don't touch documents. One of them nodded. The other took notes. The interview ended quickly, too quickly to reassure Emily. As she stood up to leave, Richard Ross walked in. He did not smile. Interesting, he said, tapping his university ring lightly against the table. You understand English quite well whenever I give instructions. Emily lowered her head. Her shoulders stiffened. Just simple sentences. Richard looked at her longer than necessary, the gaze of a man accustomed to guessing what others are hiding. I think you understand much more than that. He said nothing else, but Emily understood. That was not a comment. It was a warning. That evening, when Emily returned to the locker room, she noticed something wrong. Her locker door was slightly open. Her belongings were disturbed. Her heart raced as she checked her bag. Empty. Her father's pen was gone. Before she could react, Richard appeared behind her, his voice calm, as if commenting on the weather. Are you looking for this? He spun the pen between his fingers. The metal reflected the cold overhead lights. A rather expensive item for a cleaning employee. Emily stepped forward instinctively. Richard took one step back. Security is very interested in unusual personal items. I've already filed a report. HR will speak with you tomorrow. For the first time, Emily felt real fear, not because of the pen, but because of what he intended to do with it. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was her only emotional anchor. The next morning, HR sent an official warning email. Standardized language, no emotion. Suspicious behavior, inappropriate personal item, subject to monitoring. Emily read each line, feeling as if the air were being drained from her lungs. She had been flagged. At home, her mother was hospitalized due to dangerously high blood pressure. The doctor demanded an immediate deposit. The landlord posted a final notice on the door. Everything was closing in at once. Emily sat beside her mother's hospital bed, holding her hand. The woman squeezed back weakly. If it's too hard, don't force yourself anymore. Emily shook her head, because she understood one thing clearly. If she stepped back now, it wouldn't be only her who lost something. There would be hundreds of people who would never know why their lives collapsed. Richard Ross believed that by tightening the net he could force Emily into silence. But he had forgotten one thing. When someone has nothing left to lose, fear is no longer intense enough to bind them. And in that moment, Emily knew that. The darkness had gone too far. It was time for the light to appear. There are moments in life when every path behind you closes. Not because you chose the wrong one, but because continuing in silence has itself become a form of betrayal. That morning, Emily walked into the Weston and Cole building with a heavy pressure in her chest. Not exhaustion, not fear, but a cold clarity. The feeling of someone who understands she is standing at the final boundary. The top floor conference room was ready for a decisive meeting. A meeting where, in just a few hours, one signature could change the fate of an entire company. And quietly, the lives of hundreds of families. Emily pushed the coffee cart into the room, the same gray uniform, the same lowered gaze, the exact role they were accustomed to seeing. No one paid attention to her, and that very fact made what was about to happen unavoidable. Richard Ross stood at the head of the table, confident, composed. His voice was smooth, as if truth itself could be polished down by power. He presented the translation, numbers that sounded reasonable, phrases carefully softened. Emily stood beside the table, pouring water, listening to every word. And then, he mispronounced a term. A small mistake, so minor that most people would overlook it, but to Emily, it was the first sign of a much larger lie. Richard continued. This clause allows flexibility in workforce structure. Emily clenched her hand. No, that was not what it meant. That phrase, if read correctly, if understood in the proper context, did not speak of flexibility. It spoke of mandatory cuts. Hundreds of people, within a few months. People who were not in this room, people who would not be explained. No choice, only an email notification. just like her father years ago. Emily felt her heart pounding so hard her ears rang. She thought of her mother lying in a hospital bed, thought of her father's pen being held somewhere as a suspicious item, thought of every time she had lowered her head just to survive. And then a single, unmistakably clear thought surfaced. If I don't speak now, there will never be a right time. Richard kept talking, his voice steady, certain no one would challenge him. Emily set the water pitcher down. The sound was soft, but it echoed sharply in the silence. She lifted her head. That moment lasted less than a breath, but to Emily, it felt like an entire lifetime. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear. "That term does not mean what you just said." The room froze. Eyes turned toward her, for the first time in 7 years. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he smiled faintly. "You're mistaken." Emily took a deep breath. "No," she said, this time firmer. "I'm not." She stepped forward. "That clause requires the elimination of at least 400 production positions within 60 days. It is not flexibility. It is mandatory." The air in the room thickened. No keyboard clicks, no whispers, only the truth. Standing there in a gray uniform. Richard turned toward the CEO. "This is absurd. I'm the one reading the contract correctly," Emily interrupted. Her voice trembled slightly, but she did not retreat. "And I can't stay silent when I know the consequences." In that moment, Emily understood this. Whatever happened next, she was no longer invisible. She had stepped forward, and from here, there was no way back. There are rooms where power is accustomed to never being questioned, and there are moments when a single correct sentence, it is enough to make an entire system tremble. After Emily spoke, the conference room fell into a heavy silence. No one rushed to argue. No one dared to laugh. Eyes shifted from the janitor who had just spoken to Richard Ross, the man still standing at the head of the table, gripping his laser pointer tightly. CEO Robert Weston was the first to break the silence. "You're saying you're reading the contract correctly?" His voice wasn't raised, but it was enough to make everyone look up. Emily nodded. "I am, and I can point out every section." Richard scoffed, trying to regain control. "Are we really letting a cleaning employee disrupt a senior-level meeting?" Emily turned toward him. No anger, no challenge, only an unsettling calmness. "If what I'm saying is wrong, you can ask me to leave this room right now." The room stayed silent. "But if I'm right," Emily continued, "then you've concealed a clause that could destroy the livelihoods of hundreds of families and expose this company to severe legal risk." Robert Weston extended his hand. "Show me." Emily stepped forward. For the first time in 7 years, she walked across that room, not to clean it, but to place the truth on the table. She opened the document, pointed to the exact passage, read it verbatim in French, then translated slowly and precisely. There was no more doubt, no more ambiguity. Whispers began to ripple through the room. One board member leaned down to recheck the printed copy. Another opened a laptop to verify the text. Richard Ross began to lose his composure. "You don't have the authority." "I have the competence," Emily cut in. Her voice still trembled, but her eyes did not. "And competence doesn't need authority to speak the truth." Robert Weston looked at Emily for a long moment. "You say you know these clauses well," he said slowly. "Where did you learn them?" Emily took a breath. "I learned from my father, Michael Carter." He worked for this company for 18 years. A flicker of recognition crossed Robert Weston's face. "Carter," he murmured. Richard went pale. Emily continued, not giving him a chance to interrupt. "He worked with this French partner 7 years ago. The clauses he warned about back then are appearing again in this contract." Robert Weston turned to Richard. "How did you translate this section?" Richard hesitated. A tiny moment, but enough to reveal everything. I may have interpreted." "No," Emily said. "You deliberately misrepresented it." She raised her phone. "And this is why." The screen displayed security footage. Richard Ross, late at night in his office, holding a cup of coffee, pouring it directly onto Emily's workspace in the secondary conference room. The room went utterly still. Robert Weston stood up. "Explain yourself." Richard opened his mouth, then it closed it. There was nothing left to say. "You are suspended effective immediately," Robert said. "Security will escort you out." As Richard was led away, no one watched him leave. All eyes were on Emily. The woman standing in the middle of the conference room was no longer the janitor. She was the person who had just saved them from disaster. Robert Weston turned to her. "How long would it take you to complete this translation?" Emily looked at him. Then there were people in the room. "I've already begun," she said, "and I will finish it, if this company is willing to listen to the right person." In that moment, power in the room shifted. Not through shouting, not through force, but through something far simpler. Truth, when spoken at the right time, stands on its own. After Richard Ross was escorted out of the conference room, the room did not become louder. It became more real. There was no one left performing the role of leadership. No more carefully polished words meant to hide fear. Only people who had just realized that they had nearly signed an agreement capable of destroying everything. Emily was invited into a small office next to the main conference room. Not a luxurious space, not a privilege, just a desk, a computer, and a silence she had never been granted in 7 years. Robert Weston stood at the doorway looking at her for a long moment. "You have 18 hours, he said, "and I need a translation that is not only correct, but honest." Emily nodded. She didn't need time to prove what that meant. She opened the documents. For the first time, not secretly, not in a dark room, not in fear of being discovered. She translated line by line, phrase by phrase, not only with knowledge, but with the understanding her father had passed down to her over many years. She added notes where the cultural context was relevant, flagged clauses that could be misleading if read too quickly, marked consequences that only someone who had worked with the French partner before would recognize. Outside, New York shifted into night. City lights spilt through the window onto her desk. Emily drank coffee, the kind she had once only served to others. Around 3 a.m., her phone vibrated. The hospital. Her mother was stable, but an additional deposit was required to continue treatment. Emily set the phone down. She didn't panic like before. For the first time, she knew she would find a way. When the translation was finished, dawn was breaking. Robert Weston held the document, reading very slowly. He said nothing for several minutes. Then he looked up. "This is not just a translation," he said. "This is an understanding we've lost." The call with the French partner began immediately afterwards, and something unexpected happened. They asked Emily to stay in the meeting, not to translate, but to speak. They addressed her by name. They mentioned her father. They confirmed that this contract had been a test to see whether this company still held the values Michael Carter had once built. Robert Weston listened. This time, he did not interrupt. When the call ended, he turned to Emily. "We're going to do this again," he said, "and you will help us do it right." The payment was transferred that same day. Additionally, there was the consulting fee from the partner, enough to keep the apartment, enough to continue her mother's treatment, enough for Emily to breathe. 6 months later, Emily had a small office overlooking the city, not because she needed it, but because her work needed a place where it could be heard. On the desk, her father's pen rested neatly, no longer a suspicious object, but a symbol of knowledge. The first thing Emily did was not to change her title. It was intended to change the company's perspective on people who had long been overlooked. She reviewed labor policies, established scholarships, opened pathways for those without perfect resumes but with real ability. Because Emily understood clearly, if she only changed her own life, then the bridge her father taught her to build was still unfinished. One morning, before beginning the workday, Emily picked up the pen and whispered, "I've finished building it, Dad." And for the first time in a very long while, she was no longer living to avoid loss. She was living to begin. Some victories do not echo with applause. They linger for a long time, in the way people treat one another afterwards. After the contract was rewritten and signed as it was truly meant to be, Weston and Cole did not change simply because a new position had been appointed. They changed because a truth had been spoken, and once spoken, it could not be recalled. Emily Carter did not become a loud presence. She did not retell her story in meetings. She did not turn pain into a medal. She still arrived early, still listened more than she spoke. Only this time, when she entered a room, people made space. Not because of her title, but because of the way she looked directly at the issue and said what needed to be said, even when it wasn't easy to hear. Internal reviews began. Clauses that had once been skimmed were now read carefully. Decisions once made behind closed doors were now accompanied by a new question. Who will this affect? Emily knew this was not a miracle. It was the result of placing people back at the center. She established a scholarship fund in her father's name, Michael Carter, not for perfect candidates, but for those with real ability and no one to recommend them. She required only one thing in the application: an honest answer to the question, how have you been overlooked? Because Emily understood this clearly. Talent is rarely scarce. Opportunity is. One late afternoon, she met Ahmed again, the security guard who had nodded to her every night. He carried an engineering degree from his home country, untouched in a drawer for 10 years. Emily didn't ask why it had stayed there. She asked only one thing. Do you want to use it? Ahmed became facilities manager, not out of pity, but because he deserved it. These changes didn't make the news. They weren't written into press releases, but they spread slowly, quietly, and lastingly. At home, Emily's mother resumed studying accounting online, not to earn money, but to remember who she had been before illness claimed her. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, Emily placed her father's pen into a small crystal holder. Not for display, but to remind herself each day that knowledge is not meant to be stored. It is meant to be used at the right moment. She understood that her story was not a perfect ending. Prejudices still exist. There are still people who are looked straight through every single day. But if there was one thing Emily was sure of, it was this. All it takes is one person willing to speak at the right moment, and silence will no longer be absolute. You might be watching this story and thinking, I wasn't in that boardroom. I don't have an opportunity like that. But Emily once stood exactly where you are, in a gray uniform, called by a role instead of a name. The difference was not where she stood. It was the moment she chose not to let the truth be spoken incorrectly. The true legacy Michael Carter left behind does not live in a company or in a contract. It lives in a daughter who learned to use language to protect others, even when doing so came at a cost. And perhaps that is the question this story leaves with each of us. If you are not being seen today, will you choose silence to survive, or speak to change something, even if only a little? Because sometimes the quietest people, they are the ones who build the longest bridges. Emily Carter's story did not end the moment she stepped out of that conference room. It did not end when she received the bonus or when a new nameplate was placed on her office door. Because there are stories that do not exist to be neatly concluded. They exist to be carried forward. Emily did not become a different person after everything that happened. She remained a woman who walks slowly, speaks softly, and listens more than she talks. Only one thing changed. She no longer walked past injustice as if it had nothing to do with her. And that single change altered the way the world responded to her. Perhaps, as you are watching this story, you are not standing in a high-rise boardroom. You are not holding a contract worth millions of dollars. You do not have the chance to say one sentence that silences an entire room. But perhaps you have been. Overlooked because of your title. Underestimated because of how you look. Buried by silence, even though you know you could do better. Emily once stood exactly there. She chose silence for many years, not because she was weak, but because she needed to survive. And that is deeply human. But then there comes a moment when silence is no longer an extended protection, but becomes an unwilling form of complicity. That moment does not arrive with trumpets or spotlights. It arrives quietly, like a question you ask yourself. If I don't speak today, who will pay the price tomorrow? Emily answered that question with action, not perfectly, not without fear, but honestly. And that honesty created a crack in a wall that once seemed unmovable. This story does not claim that everyone who speaks up will be rewarded. Not every truth yields an immediate positive outcome, but it reminds us of something more important. Truth, when spoken at the right time, will find a place to stand on its own. Maybe not today, maybe not where you expect it, but it will not disappear. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to say what needs to be said for others to realize that they are not alone. Emily calls this building bridges, not bridges of fame, but bridges between people, between knowledge and courage, between those who have been looked straight through and a world learning to look more closely. Before starting each workday, Emily still holds her father's pen, not to remember pain, but to remember this. Every word written can become a choice. And now, this story is no longer hers alone. It is a gentle reminder for you, the one watching. If this story resonates with you, leave a comment and share your own experience. If you know someone who feels invisible, share this video so they know they are not alone. And if you believe that quiet stories deserve to be heard, like and subscribe to Deep Life Tales. Because here, we believe this. Every life carries within it a bridge. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to step onto it for the world to never be the same again.
Every small town in America has its legend. A patch of woods people don't walk into after dark, a road the locals avoid, a name they whisper but never say too loudly. In western Pennsylvania, that place is Dead Man's Hollow. On a fog-covered weekend in 1978, 4 college friends entered those woods for a simple camping trip, and none of them were ever seen again. What happened out there? Tonight, we reopen a case the county would rather you forgot. This is The Missing Campers of Dead Man's Hollow.